Please do.
Oh, there's a recording. And are we admitting everybody? Where do I do that? I should be,
I think Debbie can do that.
Debbie can
De-
do that.
Yeah, let's see if I can.
Are you
Hey,
a
we got
co-host,
fun.
Debbie?
I am a co-host. Alrighty, let me see. So should I just uncheck enable waiting room then?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There you go.
Wow.
And
I
here
just
they come.
so I just found out the problem. We have a problem with our internet connection here. So
That's what I
I'm doing
said.
this over the phone. Thank God for the phone.
Yeah.
All right, Mark, go ahead and I
So,
will fade into the background, but I'll be
okay.
listening
Well,
here.
do we have, I don't have a snowflake. I don't know, somebody have a snowflake they could put up, but
Just
welcome everybody to the NWSOFA Indivisible Climate Change meeting. It tends to be more than climate change. Sometimes it goes to all things environmental, and these things are all connected. But we have a great story to tell tonight. But first of all, NWSOFA started as a group that was involved in the Obama campaign, and then people decided they wanted to start focusing on issues and things. We started meeting in small groups, and Sandy Hook happened. So the first thing we started to look at was gun violence prevention. And then it's progressed from there. So to add other things, there's a Stand With Women group, and there's a healthcare group, and there's um, Reclaim Our Democracy group, uh,
Finance.
finance, the fiscal and financial. If you want to find out what's really going on with the economy, you want to click into that one. So, Jim, you have others. What else are we doing?
Gun violence group.
We got gun violence.
Gun violence prevention group.
Yep, gun violence prevention. And I think they're meeting Thursday night. But anyway, we can talk about that later. But anyway, tonight, well, some housekeeping rules here. So we're recording this, and if you have questions, would you please put them in chat and begin by saying question and put your question there. And we'll get to that, I think, after GERRI is done with her presentation. But you can raise your hands, and everybody's probably knowing how to do that. If you don't, you can raise your hand to the little heart thing at the bottom that says react. So anyway,
Question, Mark, question
yes.
for you.
Yeah.
Are we raising hands after the presentation?
That would probably be preferable. Although people may not observe that, but anyway, so anyway, we're going to start here. So I ran into GERRI, I don't know, some years ago. It was before COVID, and I think I saw that they were having this meeting on railroad safety and so on and so forth. And GERRI, do you remember? It was at a church somewhere over
Yes.
in
On the North
Deerfield.
Shore. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm not sure if it was Deerfield, but yeah, it was North Shore.
Somewhere over there. And I had worked in the environmental field, and I actually worked on one railroad derailment right around the time of the superstorm Sandy. So I was out in New Jersey, and that was vinyl chloride also. That one didn't blow up. But anyway, Lac-Mégantic, the train had blown up in Quebec, and it had rolled down the hill, and it was carrying Bakken oil, which has got a lot of methane in it. It's highly explosive, and it blew up when it derailed and fried up half the town and half the people in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec. And people started looking at this, and GERRI was shocked by this because she was living on side railroad tracks at the time, which had, trains parking all the time, and she was teaching in a school, and there were railroad tracks by there too, and we're going, might want to start looking into hazardous goods and what railroads are doing. And of course, then later on, East Palestine, Ohio started, blew up, and that train derailment, which added real interest. I'm not sure where that stands these days. I think the railroad was held responsible there, but the one in Canada, I think they got off. They didn't have to pay anything. GERRI can confirm that. But at any rate, I think I'll turn it over to GERRI, and she can tell her story. which is really interesting. And she won't let this go. She keeps coming back. So, Jerry, tell a little bit about yourself and what happened here, and start with the presentation. And thanks for coming on. And thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, it was May of 2014 when all of a sudden I realized, well, I noticed that we had gone, there was a railroad track right beside my home, and when I first moved in, it was like maybe 2 to 3 trains a day, if that, sometimes none at all. And if they were short trains, it was clickety clack. It was, it was I didn't mind that, but then in 2009, all of a sudden those 2 to 3 trains turned into about 20 that were at that point in time a mile and a half long, up to a mile and a half long. And at the time I moved a couple of springs ago, they were up to 40 a day that are now up to 2 to 2.5 miles long. So the course of my life changed when I asked myself one question, and that was, why? What are they carrying? And then I started researching that, and I was kind of traumatized by the information that I found. The first incident that came up was the Lac Mégantic, which had happened about a year earlier from when I realized what was going on. And since then, I've been to Lac Mégantic. I've met the people from Lac Mégantic, and we're still very, very close. I have just the deepest respect and compassion for them. My background is, I'm just an ordinary citizen. There's definitely nothing special about me. I could be you. In terms of, my background knowledge, everything I know about this issue, I've researched or I've talked to people. So, in terms of a grassroots effort, this is, what's evolved over time, anybody can do, trust me. My background, now I'm a retired educator. I'm a former legislative director. I did serve on the Board of Trustees for College of Lake County, but I moved and had to resign. And now I'm just call myself an activist. I want to make sure that kids at schools are safe as we can make them. So let me see if I can. Right here, and I invite you to take screenshots, or if you have a camera and you want to take pictures of anything here, please feel free to do that. These are just some organizations that I've worked with or I've talked with, I've found to be helpful sources of information. So the question now is rail safety a public concern? And I argue that it absolutely is. Trains passing through our communities travel yards from schools, parks, playgrounds, other public locations, leaving well over, I would argue, 25 million men, women, and children in the United States at risk. If you live or work near a railroad, or even if you cross over a railroad track, you're at risk. If you've been exposed to air, soil, or water that's been contaminated by hazmat cargo, you're at risk. For example, bottled water in Pennsylvania all the way in Pennsylvania was recalled because it was sourced from a location near where the East Palestine, Ohio incident took place. And if you consume produce or meat that's been contaminated by the release or fallout of hazardous cargo, you're at risk. So honestly, that's all of us. Even if we don't live near this, the toxic fallout, what we learned from East Palestine is that the toxic fallout will go as far as the air or the wind and the water aquifers can take it. Oops. Oh, I went backwards, sorry. So the most well-known incident is demonstrating the depth of regulatory failure is the explosion in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, Canada, that killed 47 citizens. And the most well-known incident demonstrating the far-reaching consequences would be the East Palestine, Ohio, which resulted in lawsuits filed by multiple Pennsylvania school districts against Norfolk Southern due to their negligence that resulted in harm to students and staff. Toxic fall, like I already said that. It'll go as far as the wind and the aquifers can carry it. And just to give you an idea, because, you know, this was a nagging curiosity of mine for a long time, is like, how do these water aquifers work? And if you look, can you guys see, Mark, can you see my pointer?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, so, you know, if you look at, you know, Pennsylvania, Ohio area, you know, these water aquifers could theoretically carry, you know, if it seeped down far enough into the ground, you know, all the way down the continent. So it can go a long way. These are the 47 faces of Lac-Mégantic, and these are the faces right here, you know, the children. I was never able to walk away from this issue because of these children's faces. When I saw them, and that's what made me think we need to make sure kids at school are safe. And being an educator, you know, I'm sensitive to that. And this is to give you an idea of the horror that these people, you know, faced that evening.
You could even see it from space, as NASA's Sumoi NPP satellite took this image of the glow of the fire. People jumped from the third floor of buildings in the central business district to escape the humongous fire. As the blazing oil flowed over to the ground, it entered the town's storm sewage system and emerged as huge fires towering from over storm sewer drains, manholes, and even chimneys and basements of buildings in the area. Around 150 firefighters were deployed to the scene, describing as looking like a war zone.
Almost soon. Oh my God.
Now, can you imagine that happening right next to us? Children are present. You know, I don't think many would actually survive if there was a Lac-Mégantic near a school. And then the East Palestine, Ohio incident. The issue I really have with East Palestine, what I want you to listen to is how the railroad companies come in and they just take jurisdiction over these incidents. Everybody's going to the railroad company for the information. You know, the governor of Ohio, the EPA, and then they're given information that is misleading at best and completely false at worst. And, you know, like it was Canadian, Canadian, was it Canadian National or Pacific? Oh no, it's Norfolk Southern, sorry. Norfolk Southern, they took their own air, water, soil assessments. And then they gave that information to, you know, the elected officials. Well, I looked at some of those assessments. They were upwind. They were on the surface of the water where vinyl chloride is known to sink to the bottom. They were in areas where you're purposely not going to find evidence of any toxic fallout. So upwind, upstream, surface water, and then they told the public that it was safe to come back. Well, people came back and they started getting sick. And as many of you know, they made Norfolk Southern they were given permission to burn off one tanker. They took it upon themselves to instead burn off 5, and the fallout, like I said before, went all the way into Pennsylvania. And let's listen to what the officials had to say.
Full burn that launched dangerous chemicals into the air never needed to happen.
The NTSB chair saying the incident commander and governor were provided incomplete info to make a decision. It also says the contractors hired by Norfolk Southern lacked the scientific background.
That's correct, Senator. It was stabilized well before the vet and burn, many hours before. They believed polymerization was not occurring. There was no justification to do a vet and burn. There was another option, let it cool down. It was cooling down. So they were provided incomplete information to make a decision.
So the goal of the railroad companies is to get the trains moving again. Clearly, they don't care about public safety, in my opinion. And you can see that from this incident. They wanted to get those tracks cleared as quickly as they could. And so they got rid of their problem by just venting the toxic chemicals, and people, including students all the way in another state and staff in schools, they ended up getting sick. They were injured. They are at risk of future diseases, and there will be a continuing need for future monitoring. So let's talk about crude oil. An explosion from crude oil can decimate everything within a 1-mile radius, a 2-mile diameter. In Lac Mégantic, their entire town center was leveled. So, when I first started, talking to people in my area, they looked at me like I was crazy, and I kept saying, I'm not making this up. If you think I'm crazy, maybe you should take a look at this. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. So yeah, everything within a 1-mile radius. And so why? Why is this happening? Why is this different? I mean, crude oil has been transported for many, many years. Why is this all of a sudden different? Well, this is why.
What's increasingly evident is that shale gas is overwhelmingly abundant right here in the USA.
In the last few years, we've discovered the equivalent of 2 Saudi Arabias of oil in the form of natural gas in the United States. Not 1, but 2.
We have twice as much natural gas in this country, is that what you're saying, than they have oil in Saudi Arabia?
I'm trying to very clearly say exactly that.
So there's been an oil boom. And so what does that look like? This is the North American shale plays. We're low. I don't know why we're getting oil from other countries when we've got plenty of gas right here in the United States. I don't know why it's expensive. It's right there. Basically, what happened is as soon as gas prices were high enough to make fracking a viable means of extraction, that's when this started taking off. So, that happened right around here, between 2007, 2009. Okay, and then you can see it's just exploded. Export volumes going, most of which go to China, we're at a record 354,000 barrels per day. That was 2018, with the vast majority of oil going to refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast and Midwest. The Alberta government planned to put another 120,000 barrels per day on the rails by 2020. You can see, 2023, we're up near, this is 1 million barrels per day on average. So we're at about close to 14 million per day. And that makes the United States the world's top crude oil producer as of 2018. And it's maintained every year since then. So you can see, this is where we were at, and 2023, here's Saudi Arabia. So we're doing quite better than they are at the moment. And to see how quickly this happened. So this is crude by rail movements. Okay, so if you've got the oil, you need a way to move it to where people will buy it. We've got 1,000 barrels per day with the thin line. You've got 100, 400, and then 800 with the thickest line. So you can see how that was moving here in 2010. By 2014, okay, 4 years later, look how quickly we've moved. Now we've got the 800,000 barrels per day. This is, the North Dakota Bakken crude there. And then the loading, the crude by rail train loading and offloading. So loading is red, offloading blue. So this is 2010. 3 years later, this is what that looked like.
Wow.
Okay, and this is 2013. I can't even find what it looks like now. This is the last I saw them publicly posting it. It might be out there. I've not seen it. So, who's behind this? The two bigwigs would be Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. Warren Buffett is the billionaire investor. He bought BNSF Railway in 2009. It's become the nation's leading hauler of crude oil, and mostly east-west, travels east-west. Bill Gates, he became the largest single shareholder of Canadian National as of 2011. He owns routes running throughout Canada, America, and Mexico. He mostly moves crude oil north and south. The dominant eastern railroads would be Norfolk Southern and CSX, Western carriers, BNSF and Union Pacific. 6 of the largest rail carriers transport crude oil throughout the Chicagoland area. Those would be Norfolk Southern, CSX, BNSF, Union Pacific, Canadian Pacific, and Canadian National. And Chicago is the hub of all of this. There's 5 rail corridors that can transport, back and forth pretty much any direction to reach anywhere in the United States. And there's more to come. So President Trump announced his plans to increase energy production in the United States. The number of freight trains on rails will continue to rise. A $31 billion merger was approved by the Surface Transportation Board to combine Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern railroads. So the CPKC merger creates the only railroad that links Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And they have their own private police that now have jurisdiction in 3 countries, which is amazing. So this is what that looks like, all the way in Canada, down to the United States, down into Mexico. And they claim that they're not going to be going through the North Shore, but I don't see how that's not going to happen. So we're watching to see what actually does happen there. The oil and the rail industries continue to obstruct the information that we as the public have a right to know. And the federal government has done very little to enforce safety standards. So the rail company has little to no accountability. Did somebody want to say something? Okay. Current policy allows the rail industry to regulate itself, empowering the industry to prioritize profits over public safety. Trains travel on turn-of-the-century railroads that were never built to accommodate the weight and the frequency of the current cargo. And train cars are inadequate for flammable materials and unable to withstand forces of an accident, even at slow speeds. So they keep saying, oh, these are the new, better rail cars that are safer. You can never make it safe. If it's going to derail, it always has the possibility to puncture. And if it punctures, it can blow up. All it needs is a spark. And track failure, track problems were blamed for more than half of the crashes, more than double the overall rate for freight train accidents. So more than half the time when a train derails, it's because of track failure. And the reason for that is the crude oil or ethanol or whatever flammable materials they're carrying, LNG or LPG, they have a sloshing effect. So just 3 inches of movement between rails or wheels lifted just a half an inch can cause a derailment. And even if the tracks conform to federal standards at the beginning of the train, because these trains are now up to 2.5 miles long, they can separate by the end of the train. Wide gauge, the space between the rails, is the single largest cause of accidents that involve track defects. And oil trains cause unusual track damage, imparting higher than usual forces to track infrastructure. And experts say that the sloshing of oil may be the primary factor contributing to track defects. It increases the severity of an accident and the risk of a tank rollover. So the unsafe rail cars, they said that the DOT 117s were the best out there. But what the Custer, Washington derailment showed us is that even traveling at slow speeds, this train was traveling 7 miles per hour on a day, yet it still derailed, cars ruptured, oil ignited, and the town was evacuated, even with the best of the rail cars. And then there's been horrific fatalities. We talked about the 47 people who died in Lac Mégantic. That fire burned for 3 days. In Cherry Valley, Illinois, there was a woman, Zoila Tellis, she was stopped at a rail grade crossing, waiting for the train to go by. It derailed, it exploded. She survived the explosion, but this was an ethanol train, and they spatter, and when they spatter, they shoot fireballs. She and her daughter, who was pregnant, tried to flee the incident. Zoila Tellis was hit by a fireball. Her unborn grandchild died. Her daughter survived, but she had been through so much trauma, the baby did not make it. So there is definitely a threat to public safety. Census data shows that there's 14,800 schools, 5.7 million students in the United States located within the oil train blast zone. That is the 1 mile radius distance from a railroad track. Chicago hosts the world's largest rail freight hub. It has approximately 1,000 trains, or about 40,000 rail cars. This is 1/4 of the nation's entire rail traffic. And there's been an estimated 77,000 kids at school in this zone. Chicago is one of the top 5 cities having children at risk. And I argue that this is a huge underestimate, because when these statistics were originally taken, I know that they did not include many railroad tracks. Mine, the EJ&E being one of them, I had to call them and say, hey, there's oil on this railroad track too. And then they did factor that in. But, if there's a railroad track, I have yet to see a railroad track without hazardous materials on it. There's nearly 400 hazardous substances that are transported by rail. And I spoke to an attorney at the Illinois, the State Emergency Response Commission, the CERC, S-E-R-C. He said you can expect any of nearly 400 substances right through Lake County. So they're all being transported through our area. These substances might include ethylene oxide, anhydrous ammonia, chlorine gas, Bakken crude oil, spent nuclear fuel, liquefied natural gas. Trains carry rail security sensitive materials, which includes military weapons such as bombs, cartridges for weapons, rockets, warheads, torpedoes, mines, grenades, ammunition, and projectiles. And just a little side note, these are in the hands of private railroad companies, which can embargo these both hazardous substances and rail security sensitive materials if they feel that there's a reason to do so. For example, in this case, I'm afraid to actually, well, let's see. They were, you know, railroad workers are not allowed to strike, but for some reason, this particular time, they took it seriously. They're one of the only unions, if not the only union, that needs permission from the government, the federal government, to be able to strike. They're never given the permission, so they're never able to strike. Yet, for some reason, back in 2024, they took their threat seriously, and they embargoed hazardous materials and rail security sensitive materials. So these, and the philosophy is that they don't want to leave this on the track in the event of a railroad strike. Well, there's never a railroad strike because it's never allowed. If it was allowed, it would have to be, they'd have to be given permission for that to happen, and they're never given permission. So, but in the meantime, the railroad companies embargoed some pretty hazardous materials. So sorry, let me get back. This is why I was afraid to do it, because I can never find my way back to my PowerPoint. Keynote. Oh boy. Ah, there we go. Hydrogen sulfide. So this is a hazardous substance. It's found in Bakken crude oil. This is what they pump into it to be able to extract the oil from the shale. It contains hydrogen sulfide. The law prohibits workers from exposure to more than 50 parts per million. Anything above that will cause shock, convulsions, coma. And if it's pushed beyond 700 ppm, death is likely within 2 breaths. Bakken crude was found to have as much as 1,200 parts per million. Exposure to hydrogen sulfide, no matter how seemingly insignificant, can lead to internal organ failure, infertility, immune system suppression, blood disorders, cancer, birth defects, and genetic mutations. So it's some pretty nasty stuff. I'm going to move this. So this is anhydrous ammonia. It's used as a fertilizer. It kills almost instantly. This is a truck. You can see right here, there is a man, probably the driver, who's probably dead. And there is a police officer coming to try to help him. Notice that this just looks like smoke. So if you're a teacher trying to get students out of a building where there's been an incident involving anhydrous ammonia, you could easily think, okay, this is smoke. I'm going to get the kids through here to the other side to where I think is a safe zone. That is a really bad idea. And this is why. And if you have young children, you know, running around the background, this is probably not something you want them to see. Oops.
What's the ETA on fire ambulance?
You can see he's falling down. And he's no longer breathing. This is how quickly this can kill somebody. This is chlorine gas.
Good evening. In a little more than 48 hours, there have been 3 railroad tank car accidents in southeastern United States. Before dawn this morning, another derailment in Youngstown, Florida, punctured a tank car, sending chlorine gas into the air and killing at least 8 people. More than 60 people are in the hospital, some of them in critical condition. Kenley Jones reports from Florida.
The train which derailed this time was a southbound freight of the Atlanta and St. Andrews Bay Railroad, a small line which operates between Dothan, Alabama and Panama City, Florida. A tank car carrying poisonous chlorine gas was ruptured in the wreck. A deadly mist of gas spread from the tank car. Motorists who were driving at night alongside the tracks were caught by surprise. Most of the victims who died were found in their cars along U.S. Highway 231.
People killed by poison gas, like they were on a battlefield in World War I or something, instead of just driving their cars along a U.S. highway.
This is LNG.
An accident involving LNG could be challenging for firefighters because if it ignites, they can't dump water on it. And safety advocates are concerned an explosion could level several blocks or a whole town. Last year, the federal regulations for moving LNG on trains changed. Now the companies don't need special permits anymore, so they can move more of it with greater ease. But the Biden administration could bring back the old rules. While that would be frustrating for some in the energy industry, it would be welcome news for the citizen groups who have been fighting this fight against what they call bomb trains.
It is a potential bomb for sure.
Fritz Edler is with Railroad Workers United, and the group wants LNG off of trains and far away from workers and passengers. Edler worked for Amtrak for most of his career and now speaks for the union on safety issues. He's particularly concerned that the FEC trains with LNG share the same rails as Brightline, high-speed passenger trains.
There's the specific question of LNG, and then there's the bigger question, the more important question of whether we're running the railroads in a safe way for any product.
For the record, Edler believes LNG isn't safe for the railways under any circumstances. LNG is carried in what are called DOT 113 containers, and trains can have 100 or more of these LNG cars, each with more capacity than what was allowed when the LNG railroad rules were made in 2015. In a federal lawsuit, the group Earth Justice claims 22 loaded LNG tanker cars have the same energy potential as the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And right now, 15 states are fighting to keep LNG trains out.
As soon as somebody figures out that they can make money doing it, they will do it, and they will route it through your town.
But one of the reasons Edler is sounding the alarm, and it's a big reason, is because he's seen railroad accidents become disasters.
Well, the town of Lochmagantic got zero benefit from having that additional risk in their community.
Rulemaking changes say it's open season on every track in the country.
Mihil showed us location after location where the tracks pass right by schools and daycares. She and many other opponents are calling for a federal crash study on the LNG tank cars to subject them to collisions at 30 and 50 miles per hour to see how safe they really are. The International Association of Firefighters and the National Association of Fire Marshals oppose LNG on trains.
So the thing that's scary about LNG, it's a frozen gas and it can travel as far as the wind will blow it until it burns itself out. It can't be put out. Other hazardous materials include ethylene oxide. It's a known carcinogen. It's linked to conditions such as leukemia, nerve damage, genetic damage, and spontaneous abortion. Highly explosive ethanol releases balls of fire, and spent nuclear fuel has been compared to an X-ray machine left on. So I've only covered a very few of nearly 400 types of hazardous materials that are going past our schools every day. So what's the problem? There's currently no school emergency response plans in place that'll meet the very unique needs of a hazmat-related incident. School districts need to be included in the development and implementation of hazmat-related evacuation plans, and administrators and teachers need to be included in that conversation. And there's no requirement. This is a huge issue right here in my eyes. There's no requirement to disseminate information about these threats related to the transport of and storage of hazardous materials to the parents of students, faculty, and staff of schools at risk. Now, these schools, for example, I spoke to officials at Lake Zurich High School, and I'm not faulting them. There's no requirement for them to say a word to anybody. But there's in my eyes, there's an ethical and there's a moral responsibility. And I really take issue to that. What the public's right to know is not up for debate. It's already been decided. There's legislation in place. SARA Title III, the Superfunds and Reauthorization Act, Title III, it protects the public's right to know about hazardous materials that could harm us. So that's not an issue. But the loophole is that there's no one who's responsible for disseminating that information. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So this is just to give you an idea of, here's your railroad track, here's Hawthorne Elementary School, and this, again, by no means a complete list, but just in our little area, Aspen Elementary School, Middle School, Hawthorne Middle School. This is the Lake Zurich High School. I mean, look at this football field and the tennis courts. And, there's private schools. This is a Lutheran school. Here's the track. Ally Stevenson, that's in the blast zone. This is the evacuation zone. This is the blast zone. So what are the odds of this happening near us? Well, it already has. There's been at least 6 freight derailments that I'm aware of in Lake County and Northern Cook County. There was 2 in Buffalo Grove, 1 in 2009, 1 in 2005. 2 in Northbrook at the same location. A couple died. They were buried underneath the rubble and nobody even knew they were there until the following day. And that didn't have to happen had they fixed it right the first time in 2009 after a 20-car derailment. The bridge was left in crumbling condition, was reported. And then there was one in Mundelein, and this is what got me wondering. It was January 2014, and between January and May, I wanted to know, but it just nagged at me, and finally I had to start researching it. And then Lake Forest, and these had the worst. The most unsafe tank cars, the DOT 111s, they've been compared to a Ford Pinto. They were originally made to haul corn syrup. And in the case of many of these derailments, neither the Buffalo Grove or Mundelein incident has a report filed with the FRA or the NTSB, which makes it very difficult, if not impossible, to figure out how many freight train derailments there actually are. Yeah, I couldn't find it on there. And it's been reported, if you talk to railroaders, they say every day. Derailments are happening every day. And the dangers of these derailments are consistently minimized. So East Chicago, a total of 18 cars derailed, 41 cars became disconnected, which pulled a total of 113 cars. A dozen were on their side, and it was reported that the tracks were adjacent to underground pipelines. And I've since heard that it's very common for pipelines to be running adjacent to the railroad tracks, which, think about how heavy the railroad trains are, the trains are now, the freight trains are now. And now you've got pipelines with the vibration of the ground. That just doesn't seem like a good idea to me. But this is what was reported. Okay, and I'm going to show you what was reported, then I'm going to show you what the potential of this derailment could have been.
Now, NBC5 investigates yesterday's train derailment in nearby East Chicago, Indiana. Newly designed tank cars may have limited the damage. Chris Coffey joins us now to explain. Chris?
We've reported on crude oil train incidents in the past in which fireballs shot to the sky or the product leaks, but that's not what happened this time. From the looks of it, these train cars took a beating in Wednesday's derailment in East Chicago. The train was transporting Bakken crude oil to a refinery, according to CSX. Fortunately, nothing leaked, there were no fires, and no one was injured.
You're transporting at maximum speed that's allowable here, and you had the cars derail, and the product was contained.
If this happened several years ago, could have been a different outcome. These are newer and stronger tank cars, and they're now required by the federal government.
They have several levels of protection, thermal protection, all these things. So, you know, even you can see some have like little dents, things like that, but, you know, all the product was contained.
The feds want to avoid scenes like this from 2015 in Galena, when a derailed crude oil train shot flames into the sky.
There's a lot of residential area around here, and that could have been pretty ugly.
This East Chicago business owner says he feels better about the new tank cars that often roll by his donut shop.
But you know, when you live in an area like this, surrounded by refineries and train tracks, you know, there's always a level of concern.
CSX says the crude oil will be drained from the tank cars and sent to refineries for processing. The tank cars themselves will get scrapped.
So these are newer, safer tank cars. Well, these are the same new, safe tank cars that blew up in Cooster, Washington. And in fact, they failed in 5 out of 5 major derailments. So let's take a look. You know, he said surrounded by refineries. Let's take a look at what he's looking at. So this is where that train derailed. Right here is East Chicago Urban Enterprise Academy. It's a.
Look, Jerry, you seem a little bit faint. Can you get closer to the microphone?
Sure, I'm sorry.
Better.
This is a private school, but so the train derailed here, and here you can see some of the refineries. And, you know, I was questioning, like, where is this pipeline going? Well, this is where it was going. Now let's pan out and take a better look at this. Can you imagine if there was a derailment that exploded like a Lockmead Antique, or, you know, at some of the other ones we've seen, Castleton or North Dakota or wherever? Look at these refineries. I mean, this could have blown East Chicago off the face of the map. And not only here, there could have been a domino effect. You know, here they're comparing this to a Hiroshima bomb. You know, could that have ignited this and then this and then this? Nobody ever talked about this. Completely downplayed, minimized. And I love how she says, oh, it had a few bumps. It had tears in it. So they're minimizing, purposely minimizing the risk to the public. And Madison, I don't know how many of you heard of Madison, Illinois?
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Yeah. So everybody's up in arms about the 5 tankers that were, you know, burned off in East Palestine. Well, they burned off 11 tankers in Madison.
Okay, right now we want to give you a live look from Skycam 9 at the controlled burn that has been going on in Madison. Cleanup has been underway in the south suburb after yesterday's train derailment. A controlled burn has been ongoing throughout the day and into the evening hours as crews get ready to remove more than 24 train cars.
Cleanup is underway from the train derailment in Madison. The mayor is set to address this matter at 5 o'clock. She plans to discuss her anticipated briefings with CN Railroad. That's the company responsible for the train. Officials evacuated nearby homes as a precaution, but found no chemical spills. The company says 25 rail cars derailed carrying various substances. Train movement on that track is expected to resume this afternoon. The company released this statement saying CN will also be conducting a controlled flaring of 11 cars that contain a residual amount of LPG. There is no danger to public safety or the environment. Flaring is a controlled burning of residue gas over a short period of time. Out of an abundance of caution, CN will be monitoring air quality. We are working closely with government officials.
So I want to know, why is it left to Canadian National to be monitoring the air? That's a conflict of interest. And for them to say that liquefied petroleum gas is safe, well, I don't know where they're coming up with that information, because when I look at LPG, at high concentrations, it can cause asphyxiation, seizures, comas, heart problem, and death. Inhalation may cause drowsiness, dizziness, and respiratory irritation, eye and skin irritation. It could cause frostbite because it's frozen. Long-term exposure might lead to central nervous system damage, nosebleeds, rhinitis, oral nasal ulcerations, conjunctivitis, weight loss, and fatigue. So, central nervous system damage concerns me. And, is there any long-term toxic fallout still left? I mean, you saw where they're just releasing it, the residue from 11 tankers right into the air, and they're leaving it to Canadian National to monitor that. So we need to realize that the railroad companies are not our friend. We should not be depending on the railroad companies to disclose train consists in a timely manner. If there's a derailment, we should not expect them to allow us to access railroad infrastructure. It's their private property, even though we pay for a lot of their infrastructure. And don't rely on railroad companies to tell the truth. Historical examples indicate a pattern of non-disclosure, minimizing, and outright lying. A whistleblower report and lawsuit were filed in Canada against both CP and CN, accusing these companies of using their own private police to cover up evidence that could lead to a wrongful death conviction. This is about their private railroad police.
Police to look into what went wrong and who's responsible was the railway's own police force.
So I was the primary investigator of the file.
This former CP police officer was assigned to look at the actions of the crew. He even began looking into possible negligence by his own company.
I was ordered to stop investigating.
He says he was shut down just 1 month after the derailment.
In my opinion, I would say it was some type of cover-up or an attempt to not provide information that might be damning.
We cannot have CP Rail investigating themselves when there is something so devastating and important as a worker's death.
Lawyer Tavengwa Runonapraw represents a number of families of rail workers killed on the job.
We need to change the system immediately.
He says railway police shouldn't investigate their own companies and is calling on the government to change the law.
How can you go and ask the person who writes your paycheck whether they are responsible for something criminal? Right? These officers are 100% employees of CP Rail.
We have to put an end to this archaic notion that rail companies, some of the biggest corporations in our country, can police themselves.
Whenever I raise this with people, including lawyers who you'd think would be aware of these issues, the response I always got was, well, no, of course not. Those are not real police forces. It's like a security force. They might have, a badge that says police, but they're not real police forces. But they're actually arguably the most powerful police forces we have in North America, because both CP Railway and CN Railway operate in the United States. So this police force is a cross-border police force.
And what we learn is Mark Deterra, the constable, he arrives and after securing the scene wants to investigate, okay, what happened? And he gets into meetings with his bosses and they're like, okay, yeah, we'll look at the events, but we're just going to look at like the 24 hours ahead of time. And he's like, well, hold on. Like, what about the history of this train? Like, were there inspections done? He starts asking questions, and Mark Deterra, he says, no, we need to look at the history of this train and figure out what happened here.
He was put under a tremendous amount of pressure to drop his investigation after 30 days, even though he wanted to continue the investigation and to focus on CP Railway's potential liability for the incident.
So these are the companies that we are relying on to do our air, water, and soil assessments and trust that they're actually giving us truthful information. I don't trust them. and I urge you to be very skeptical yourselves. These are the 4 bits of information that they do not want us to know. They don't want us to know routing choices. They don't want us to know worst case scenario models. They don't want us to know the insurance amount that they have to cover themselves. And they don't want us to see their emergency response plans when the unthinkable happens. This has been dubbed the oil train secrets. And there's been a call for their public release, and as of yet, they're still keeping them secret. Back in 2020, after trying to take all this in and process it and figure out what to do, I did work with Senator and was able to get SR 984, hazardous material near school, passed. This was a resolution. And as most of you know, I imagine, a resolution is nothing more than a suggestion, but it at least put the issue out there and made our legislators aware of the issue. Most recently, we finally had a victory after 2014 to 2025. 11 years it took, but we finally had a victory. SB 71 was passed unanimously in both houses of our General Assembly. This legislation will help keep kids at school safer. Not safe, they're still not safe. But if something horrible happens, at least there's going to be a plan to respond to it. What SB 71 does is it amends the School Safety Drill Act and provides that the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, along with the Office of Homeland Security, and in consultation with the State Board of Education, shall develop guidance for Illinois schools to incorporate hazardous waste spills and explosions into their emergency plans. So, you know, what I kept hearing from schools is we already have emergency response plans. Well, you know, if you have a fire drill, what teachers are going to do is they're going to take kids out from every, you know, side of a building, you know, usually into a parking lot or, you know, some space alongside the school, and they're going to stand there and wait to be told what to do. Okay, well, that's not what you want to do if you have, you know, an incident involving hazardous waste. By July 1st of 2027, each school district will determine procedures based on this guidance. So it's in the works, but you know, there's still things that schools can do in the meantime. There's nothing preventing them from implementing their own plan, which can be modified when, you know, the guidance is in place. So in order for school, you know, why is this important? In order for school personnel to manage hazardous materials incidents safely and successfully, they need to take part in pre-incident planning, preparedness training, exercises, and implementation of incident management systems specific to hazardous substances and rail security sensitive materials. The process of training and exercises will help in facilitating preparation, making connections, and identifying gaps and priorities. And you need to prepare for students and staff that might have medical needs, students with special needs, students on 504 plans. When I spoke to the officials over at Lake Zurich High School, I have worked with students diagnosed with autism. They're going to be in crisis. If I had to get a class of students, you know, autistic students, to a safe zone on my own, I'd be shocked if that could ever happen. They're, you know, when they're in crisis, you're not going to be dealing with a rational person. They're going to be scared to death. You know, they're sensitive to loud noises. They're sensitive to a lot of motion. You're going to have smoke, probably. You're going to have people screaming. You're going to have, you could have fire. And to think they're just going to walk with you. You know, I told them they may need to be restrained. You know, not that that's something I would want, but you need to have permission to be able to do that in an emergency situation. You need to decide, is that how you're going to deal with it? It may not, it may be your only choice. But you need to start thinking about these things ahead of time rather than trying to work it all out when you're in the middle of a crisis. So these are suggestions. I want to emphasize, I am not, I don't have a background in emergency response, but what I have done is a lot of research. I've spoken to, for example, Jim Appleton, who was first on scene in the Mosier, Oregon incident. Yeah, I've talked to, as I said, people in Lac-Mégantic, and these are some, and just these are some precautions that have come out of those conversations. But this is not a complete list, and as I said, I'm not a professional with a background in this. But these are some things I encourage you to think about. The thing I emphasize most, I think is one of the most important things that needs to be done, is that jurisdiction over incident command needs to be predetermined. Because what the railroad companies want to do is they want to step in and they want to take over a jurisdiction. And what we learned from East Palestine, Ohio, is that's a really bad plan. And it's not in the public interest. And it's what led to the mismanagement of the incident and the misleading information that was put out to unsuspecting residents and who were needlessly exposed to toxic vinyl chloride. When it's burned, it turns into I forget the name of the gas, but it was a is it phosgene gas? So vinyl chlorine turns into phosgene gas when it's burned. That was a chemical that was banned after World War I during the Geneva Conventions. It was banned for use as a chemical warfare weapon because it's so deadly. That's what was released on the people of East Palestine all the way into Pennsylvania. Also, to understand the difference between policy and law, the railroad companies may say, it's our policy that we take jurisdiction. Well, maybe schools can write their own policy that they take jurisdiction over incidents. And either way, a policy is not the same as a law. You're not going to be put in jail if you don't do what the railroad company tells you to do. And speaking to emergency responders in both Lake County and McHenry County, they said a four-corner evacuation plan is needed because evacuation for students will literally depend on which way the wind is blowing. A hierarchy of command is needed and an integrated incident command system that includes persons employed by public works departments, transportation departments, hospitals, heavy equipment contractors, food distributors, and other such organizations. The ICS should be implemented as a mandatory channel for communication. Stakeholders need teams at appropriate levels that have certified and trained personnel who can integrate into an ICS organization. An incident response plan will function more efficiently if each stakeholder knows how the entire response plan works and how to function within it. And very simple things can be done to protect students and staff, like locking down water fountains or just turning the water off so that students aren't drinking it until you know that it's safe. That was not done in Pennsylvania schools. Providing schools with a windsock or some other means to help them determine which way the wind is blowing. And I told my grandson, who is in the Lake Zurich High School District, the wind needs to be in your face. And if the wind in your face is leading you back to the incident, then you're going to go right or left. You don't want to go back to the incident. And schools should be prepared to take their own independent air, soil, and water assessments to determine for themselves whether or not conditions are safe. And if you want to take a picture of this, these are water assessment companies that I've used. This is an independent laboratory. The National Testing Laboratories was one of the laboratories used for the residents of East Palestine when they finally did decide to do their own assessments. And the University of Illinois has a water assessment database. They used to provide water assessments. They no longer do that, but they do have a database, you know, and they might be a good source of information if, you know, if you want more information about that topic. And speaking to former Mosier, Oregon Fire Chief Jim Appleton, he said the single most important asset needed to cool off tankers is access to water. You want to make sure that, like in my former neighborhood, there were no oh my gosh.
Hydrants.
Thank you. I guess I'm getting to the end of my presentation. I've got brain fog now. But right, there were no fire hydrants. The water would have needed to be carried by fire trucks that carry water, which could, because of shared agreements, be all the way over on the south side of Chicago. So that was, I need to just get out of my house and watch it burn down, get as far away from it as possible. That was my only alternative in my last home. I did talk to Lake Zurich High School. They do have fire hydrants there and access to water, so that is a good thing. But he said that the foam that was, you know, originally touted as being, you know, designed to fight these oil fires, he said, as a joke, it does not work. The metal's too hot. The foam will land on the white hot metal and evaporate without any suppression effect. And private companies like Medline, they mark their emergency routes and their safe zones. So if private companies are doing this, certainly our schools should be doing it also. Potential impact zones should be identified and visibly marked, and safety zones should be identified and visibly marked. And, you know, again, this is, you know, talking about future needed legislation. There needs to be something in place that mandates information getting to parents. I mean, can you imagine you've got your child in a school, you trust that they're as safe as they possibly can be, yet there's a danger out there, you know, a legitimate threat, and the school never bothers to tell you. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And potential impact zones should also be communicated to parents. It could be communicated during student registration. So I'm going to recommend right here, I'm going to put this, when I stop talking here, I'm going to put this link. I highly recommend that all of you watch this because it tells you the breakdown of why we don't know, even though we have a right to know. And as I said before, it's not a question of whether or not, you know, it's always, we don't want to alert the public. We don't want to upset them. We don't want them worried. That's not an issue. We already have the right to know. So, you know, worrying about how the public takes the information, that's not the school's problem. The problem, the ethical and moral responsibility is that they have a right to know, and schools do know. Therefore, schools should take part in communicating that information. And the way it's currently set up is that the private railroad companies are supposed to report their train consists to the local emergency planning committee, which in Illinois, every county has a LEPC. And that information is supposed to be available to the public. Well, I tried to get the information, and the LEPC told me I had to go to the state CERC. The CERC told me I had to go to the LEPC. I FOIA'd both of them. I finally did get information from the LEPC, and it was in no format that I could make sense of. It's not organized. It's not current. You know, it says, you know, like in the past month, we might have been bringing this type of cargo, but trying to get the actual numbers and trying to make sense of that, I was not able to. Maybe I need to try to have another go at it. But at the time, the time I had to look into that, I had a very difficult time trying to get that information, and it's purposely set up that way. And Fred Millar can tell you all about that. And please take a picture of this. These are the targets. We still need to be advocating for railroad safety, for the public, for our railroad workers. And the way to do that, these are the agencies that we need to go to. The DOT, they're the entity that pushes for the regulations. The FRA writes it along with PHMSA. They'll write the regulations, and then the OMB will review those rules. And this is the point at which the rail company executives will meet privately with members of the OMB, and they will say whether or not they want these regulations. And the OMB has a history of listening to them, sometimes over public interests. And then ultimately it's OIRA that will review those rules that do get through the OMB, and they will finalize those regulations. And Congress does have oversight over all of those agencies. Yet they seem to very rarely exercise their authority. These are some tools to help monitor what might be going through your area. This is a mark search. If you see right here, there's a mark. There will be marks on tankers. You can put that into this website, and it'll tell you where these tankers originated from. Diamond-shaped placards right here identify the contents if they're labeled properly, which they were not in the Lac-Mégantic incident. And these are some apps that you could use to, to look that information up. And last two slides here, Lake Zurich High School, May Whitney High School. This is a hypothetical incident. If there was a derailment, this is the main entrance, which is often where your leadership, offices are, and your intercom system. Well, if there was an incident here, where, a train blows up and catches on fire, it could level the front of this building potentially. So you could lose your communications, you could lose your leadership. And then if the wind is blowing this way, you don't want to come out of the building. Definitely don't want to come out this way. You don't want to come out this way. You want to go, west and then south would probably, again, I don't have a background on this, but when I look at this, that's what would make sense to me. So some of the things you want to consider, where's the location of your communications and leadership? Where's the slope of your land? In Lac-Mégantic, there was a river of fire. The crude oil leaked, emptied from the tankers and formed a river which caught on fire and went down into Lac-Mégantic. And I spoke to people who saw that, and they said that fire was so unbelievably hot, they could not believe how quickly people would catch on fire and were gone. So you want to pay attention to the slope of the land. Are you going to have the contents of tankers going this way into the school? Which way is the wind blowing? What are your evacuation route options? You want to keep something, preferably maybe the building, in between the derailment and your evacuation route. What is the distance to your safe zones? How are you going to get kids there? And how are you going to access medical assistance? And, you might have kids that need medication. Where are they going to get that medication? Like students who might have seizures or other types of needs. This is another interesting scenario. I spoke to people from the Jewish Community Center in Northbrook. They're locked in. I mean, if they had a derailment here, this is like their only exit. They've got the railroad here, they've got a highway here, they have homes here. I asked them, can you get kids through here in some way? I mean, you're going to be going through private property. I imagine the homeowners probably wouldn't care if there was an emergency, but it's not ideal, certainly. So, you know, these are some of the things we really need to start, because every situation is going to be different, which is why we need to start thinking about it now. And I do see Tamara Brown has had her hand up. And I don't know if there's other people who have other questions. I'm going to stop sharing.
So Jerry, just let me tell people something here.
Absolutely.
You told me the other day you sort of gave up. You sort of gave up. You thought nothing could happen, but you were able to sell your house and move somewhere else. And, you know, you had to deal with some other family issues and a bunch of other stuff. But lo and behold, the legislation you were working on got through the state legislature and got passed. It's waiting, I think, for Pritzker's signature, right?
Yes.
So if you think you can't do something, Jerry's an example of somebody who doesn't give up, and you can actually have an effect on something.
Yes.
So with that, maybe we could go to Tamara. Is Jerry? Somebody you should know. She's worked as a lobbyist in D.C. and she knows how things work. And then Jerry, or then Debbie, maybe you can go to questions. So thanks, Jerry. You know, this is a scary stuff, but we need to deal with it and be dealing with it. So anyway, Tamara, I think you're up.
Yep, I unmuted her.
Oh, great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mark and Jerry. Thank you for a very, how should I say, expanded overview of all of these issues that pertain to safety, you know, through the rail network and transportation. As some folks know, they're in this group and in the larger group. I work in the area of public policy on the federal side and have worked with a number of states on a variety of issues, primarily trade, but quite a bit on infrastructure and environment, including transportation. So first, I want to say thank you for the work you've done and congratulate you on working on that legislation in the state of Illinois. I'm in Indiana, here just close to the state line, just outside of the Chicago area. And we are not strangers to the rail issues. And the slide that you pointed out for East Chicago, Indiana, was spot on. We've had a number of derailments here and people just turn their heads. And the one thing I'd say, Jerry, and I was going to ask you, just because I've worked with PIMSA, I've worked with FRA, the whole crew, it's a very big struggle just because of the nature of the industry and their access and their lobby, to be honest. Even to get pass-by lane protection on double track crossings is a struggle here in Northwest Indiana. And that doesn't even cover what's being transported. So, you know, as you saw on the map and as people saw tonight, we have an incredible amount of energy products moving through this corridor, east, west, and north, south. And Jerry, my question is this. What I've seen where there's been success on a multi-state level is building through these regional networks. And the Great Lakes has a pretty good network on other areas, say water quality. They've been doing more work in these coalitions on air quality. Has it been your experience in the recent few years that you've been working on this? And before then, have you been able to coalesce with any people across the state lines, especially here in Northwest Indiana, say Wisconsin, all the areas where we have this traffic with regard to rail safety issues, especially hazardous materials? Because as you said, the cities and towns that are located just east of Chicago on the southern rim of Lake Michigan have very tight contiguous boundaries, and they are populated by miles and miles of rail track. And to be honest, it's been an economic issue here for probably a century because so many of the people relied on the railroads for jobs. And so often the people turn their head when it comes to safety unless it happens in their backyard. So that was my question was, have you had any opportunity to engage with people here? It's a struggle here because we do not even have, say, a 2 or 3 county notification system on hazardous material breaches. And that was the perfect example, unfortunately, was 2 years ago when the oil refinery BP in Whiting had a huge breach. And people were only learning through social media that it happened. But we didn't have a countywide push here, a PIN notification that would say, hey, shelter in place, there's been a hazardous material, breach in, say, Whiting, Indiana, et cetera, et cetera. So just wanted to share that. Thank you for what you've done. I know it requires a lot of time and energy, and we'd be a lot better if there were people like you and all of us working hard to get these things done. So thanks again for your contribution.
Well, thank you. I have worked with other organizations. One of the organizations is a citizen organization over in Lac-Mégantic, trying to hear their stories and trying to, learn from their experience and what kind of precautions we can take to try to prevent some of the things that they experienced. I've also, there's an organization called CARS, C-A-R-S, Citizens Against Railroads, I guess. I'm not sure. I don't remember what the acronym, I'm horrible with acronyms, but it's CARS. And I've even reached out, because what I'm trying to do right now is I'm trying to reach out to Sierra Club state chapters, in states other than Illinois. So like I said, in Michigan, we do have a senator right now who's drafting a Michigan version of this bill. So I've contacted others, leadership in Sierra Club chapters. I do hear a lot of hemming and hawing, and I understand why. It's very frustrating for somebody, for anybody who's passionate about an issue, and you want everybody to be just as passionate, especially when it comes to the safety of children. That brings me to a whole nother level of concern. But my issue is not everybody's issue. And you have to have volunteers. I mean, Sierra Club is a volunteer organization, so you're depending on people to, donate their personal time to a cause that you think is important. So it's difficult, it's frustrating, it takes time. But I'll tell you, I've had a lot more success just going to the legislators. Now, first you got to convince them that this is an issue that people are concerned about. And it took me a long time to do that. I knew it was an issue when I saw Lac-Mégantic. It took legislators, East Palestine, for that to happen. So, nearly 10 years before they figured, maybe this is a problem. Okay. But, I find that, the best way to approach them, and maybe first go to the Speaker of the House or go to the committee, like the Education Committee or, emergency response, go to the legislators responsible for that issue, and then call their office, meet with them face to face. Like we've gone all the way to Washington, D.C. to talk to legislators and found that many of them have no clue about the issue. They really are clueless.
Well, I worked on the Hill, so I mean, you're speaking to somebody who's been it, lived it. So
it's not that they're ignorant, but they're ignorant of that specific issue. You can't expect them to know everything. Especially when, like, I've spent so much time, I can talk for hours on this, and trust me, I was a figure skating mom. I didn't know anything about politics. But when you have an atomic bomb sized fire under you behind it, it gives you a whole new motivation. But, meet with them and talk to them and, bring them pictures. Like, pictures speak volumes, when they can see what the rail explosion looks like, and then tell them, imagine this is your child's school, then
I guess my point, because I'm obviously familiar with all the big national enviro groups and safety groups, but I was just thinking more of the community-based groups. Like here in Northwest Indiana, there's a couple here that focus on safety and quality issues as a result of the refinery, because for people that are not familiar with it, before my time, there was a horrible explosion in Whiting, Indiana in the 50s. And it basically almost blew up the half of the town. It's a corporate town because it was the old Amoco plant that became BP. But there are pockets of people in these communities who have they're doing a pretty good job in educating the town officials and the city officials to engage with state. Now in Indiana, we have, it's a very different perspective in politics because it's, leave your hands out of government. They should not be involved. They're starting to relax a lot of the environmental standards we have here through our state environmental agency. But for rail and transport here, it's always been the big bread and butter for this region. So, but I do know, and that's why I'd asked, I didn't know if you had coalesced with any of those people. I've had experience with Sierra and all the others, and there's a lot of red tape and a lot of structure, and you have to go through a lot of different hoops, to get that issue up front. But I could tell you, there's a lot of people on the activist side that would be ready and willing, to jump in to focus on getting more state bills enacted and, possibly stronger federal legislation, which there have been efforts, but it's not been successful, and it comes to enforcement as well. And PIMSA is very guilty of it because they can hardly handle the pipeline, enforcement and regulations, let alone, dealing with railroads. So that was just my point. I just didn't know if you had any success across the state line in this area because, obviously everywhere we go, the rail is in bad shape. They have to invest in new rail, new ties. There's a lot of different things going on, but most importantly is the safety perspective of spills and derailments, as you said, near schools, but any community, by any complex. So, and you'd be surprised, just to talk, like you said, to talk to people, and they kind of look at you funny when you say, well, wait a minute, there weren't proper safety, rail guidelines there at that crossing, and those young people were killed. And they kind of look at you odd, like, well, whose responsibility is that? And I'm like, well, it's supposed to be the railroad, but the town's supposed to enforce it. And the towns are very silent because of the jobs issue. So it becomes kind of complicated. And the unions too. You've got the unions, they're involved in, because they've been shorted out in the rail system. So I just wanted to share that. I didn't mean to monopolize the discussion. Thanks.
Jerry, maybe you need to make a trip over to meet with Tamara.
Yeah.
Anyway, just a thought.
If you have any contacts, please give them to me. I'll call them.
Yeah, put it in the chat. And I think Garrick is up next. And Rudy, Debbie, do you want to monitor questions, or what should we do?
Yeah, I already have the questions copied, pasted already. So we'll go to Garrick, and then after Garrick, we will read questions.
Garrick, you're up.
Hi, Jerry. Hi, Jerry. I'm Garrick from South Elgin, like you. I'm a teacher. I'm retired now. And to paint a quick picture, my wife and I live in South Elgin. We taught in Elgin School District U46. And for those of you that don't know, they're the largest district in Illinois outside of Chicago. It's roughly 90 plus square miles. And there's probably 8 or 9 communities that make up this district. There is I believe it's Canadian National Rail line, I'm not positive, but it runs north and south right through the middle of this district. It goes through Hoffman Estates, east side of Elgin, Bartlett, and Wayne. Along that route that I just mentioned, there are 4 grade schools, one of which, the one in Elgin, is being under construction to become a middle school. So now that population is going to double or triple. All of these schools are within probably a half mile. When you were talking about East Palestine, which happened a few years ago, I started reading up on this. And one thing that I was reading about was legislation or regulation, I'm not sure, maybe Tamara can comment on this, about converting these tanker cars from single hull to double hull. I don't know if that got kiboshed by the railroad lobbyists or not. And then a second follow-up question in regards to an actual emergency: how equipped are our fire chiefs in these towns to be able to handle a situation of this intensity immediately? I mean, oil and gas is one thing, but you were talking about chemical spills. I mean, how they react to a catastrophe like this depends on some quick thinking and knowing what the product is that is burning up. Have you found any information on either one of those double hull cars or fire chief's response?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the single or double hull cars. I'm not sure what you're referring to.
The tankers, they were trying to make them safety hulls or something.
Yeah, they're
And
not
I think
safe.
you said they don't work very well.
No, they're not going to be safe. And
well, the one, yeah, I was just going to.
Uh-huh.
Oh, can't hear you, Tam. Hold on. Got to find you and see if you kind of muted yourself or if somebody muted you. Hold on. Let me look. Hold on. There you go.
Can you hear me now, Deb?
Yes. Okay. You're
Okay.
good.
Yeah. And Garrett, you raised a good point about the double hull. They were always single hull. And the steel industry, who I work with on a day-to-day basis, they were making the argument that, I mean, just look at it this way, they were going to create greater demand for their product to go into double hull tankers. And there was a technology they used that they argued would lead to really reduce any internal corrosion in the hull. I'm not necessarily sure if they made the argument. I don't think anything could be fireproof. And so I think it was the point of being able to hold the contents in a safer, more condensed way where it would be less prone to exterior, but also interior elements. Now, on the crash side, I'd have to look into that, but I can remember that discussion. I was actually at a hearing for that a couple years back. And a lot of that, it predated East Palestine, but it's been a big issue. And on emergency response, it's a patchwork. It's like a quilt, Garrick, in terms of who's got more experience, who's got the foam, who's got the materials that can fight back a hazardous material leak. And I only know that because my friend used to be the U.S. fire administrator, and she would tell me, hey, Tamara, all over the country, you have some that are better equipped, and it's got nothing to do with the size of the town or the city. It really just has to do with the dedication of dollars for them to have those materials available to counter any kind of safety breach, an accident.
Yeah, I mean, we depend more and more on volunteer firefighters. State to state, LEPCs, local emergency response committees, are set up differently. Here in Illinois, every county has a LEPC. In Lake County, there are only 3 paid staff. In McHenry, there are only 4 paid staff. They rely on volunteers. So if we ever had, some sort of a natural disaster or a terrorist attack or some, Lac Mégantic type of incident, we're going to be in trouble. In my opinion, they're not prepared to be able to respond effectively.
Yeah, they won't know what's happened, and they won't have proper PPE to deal with it.
Right. Well, look at
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I was just going to say in Galena, it was volunteer firefighters that went to put that fire out. They were on the fire truck. They were brought to as close as they could get to the incident, but the fire truck couldn't make it all the way there. So they took their, whatever tools with them, and they're, romping through the trail, trying to get to the incident. They finally get there. They take one look at it, drop the stuff they had carried right there, and ran back to the truck saying, what do you want us to do? Totally unprepared, unequipped, and unable to respond to that type of, incident.
But the one thing I'd say, though, Garrett, real quick is, but each state has a Department of Homeland Security, and under that Homeland Security area, irregardless if it's Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, they all have subunits there for fire and emergency response. I only speak on that because obviously being in DC there during 9/11 and anthrax, I witnessed a lot. And even here now in Northwest Indiana, we've seen a couple instances where there were incidents even of trucks, that had hazardous materials and close, 8094 here, the main artery. So, but it really depends. Now, mostly in this area, we have paid professional firefighters. We have some small communities that have a combination of paid professional, and as I still call them, professional volunteers, because they still go for training. And I understand, my sister and I were at a Homeland Security conference a couple months ago, and we asked the county coordinator, how often do these communities talk with law enforcement, fire, et cetera, health departments to prepare, unfortunately, for one of these kinds of disasters. And they've been doing drills here the last, I'd say, couple of years. I don't know how often they've been this year, in 2025. But that at least I felt pretty good about, that they're sharing information, and they know, because as I said, Jerry, in East Chicago, where you showed that map. So East Chicago's a city and Hammond's a city and Gary's a city, and they're all next to each other there. So, their responders would be there, but they would call it mutual aid, because they'd bring all the other folks in, to help combat, any kind of situation like that.
Thank you.
And Jerry, I'll just end with this real quickly. As an educator, if I was a principal of one of these school buildings and we heard a boom and we knew it was a train derailment, I guess the first thing, that probably the most prudent thing, is which direction is the wind coming from?
Yeah, and well, do you want to shelter in place, or do you want to get the kids out of there? And I would think,
right.
Again, I'm not a professional, but I would think you'd want to get the kids out of there, given the toxicity.
But then again, if it's a chemical spill with wind, if you could take the wrong direction with a chemical spill versus a fire, boy, you could be walking right into the death trap that video that you showed of that officer. It's scary.
And in East Palestine, it took over a half an hour to be able to contact anybody from Norfolk Southern who could tell them what the train consist was. And even at that, the answer was, we'll get back to you. So after a half an hour, you'll get back to us. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is, I believe the railroad tracks that you're speaking of going out toward Elgin, that's the merger. That's the CPKC merger. And that's
we have a crossrail. It's actually our metro that comes from Elgin to downtown, goes east to west, and it crosses that Canadian National line. Like I said, I think it's Canadian National. I'm not positive, but that CN line, that carries a lot of tanker cars, trains. And with the metro schedule, boy, one screw up on a train assignment, etc., and we've got a major catastrophe on our hands. But anyway, thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. It was very informative. Thanks again.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Well, let me see what was in the chat. Hold on one moment. Okay, we have one from Mark that says, two interesting sources on this are Rachel Maddow's book, Blowout, and Richard Heinberg's book on the fracking industry. Question, has the rail industry taken steps to address any of this?
No.
No.
See, that was simple.
Yep. Next.
You got your answer, Mark. Short and sweet. Okay.
In fact, they're doing everything they can to cover up, minimize, and mislead.
Turn the other cheek, yeah. Miriam has a question. It said, did you say that an accident involving oil transportation affects a distance of 1 mile?
The bomb train, it was Forest Ethics that later became Stand. They published information known as the bomb train blast zone, which is the 1 mile radius from a railroad track. That is a potential blast zone.
Okay, and I'm taking, depending on the wind direction, it can go, what comes out of that blast zone can go farther.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
so
I've seen evacuations up to 3 miles, but it depends on chemical and, they're going to vary.
And that's what's sad. But okay, Kathy has a question. It says, is it possible to have an effective emergency response plan for a school full of children in an event like this?
Well, if I had my way, I'd have a new law saying that you can't have a school anywhere near a railroad track. But even that wouldn't do it, because East Palestine shows that it's like, how far can you get a school away? So this is not the answer. This, in my mind, this is just a point to start getting people to think about this issue. I've spoke to like Fritz Edler, who was in one of those newsreels. I've spent a lot of time with him. He believes that the railroads can move hazardous substances safely if they were given the tools to do so. And that is never provided by the railroad company. They're slashing costs here, slashing costs there. They don't get enough sleep. They have unbelievable attendance policies. They're treated like subhuman species. I mean, animals are treated better than railroad employees, which is horrible. But he believes if they're given, good tracks, speed limits, safe working conditions, he believes that it can be done safely. So, having an emergency response plan in place is a start, but ultimately we still need to be, talking to our legislators about railroad safety and putting people before the profits of private railroad companies.
Okay, Miriam has a question that says, was Pete Buttigieg aware of this hazard when he was Director of Transportation?
Yes.
That answered that. Vicky's question is, school emergency operations plans in Illinois include a threat-specific annex for hazardous materials incidents. Are you saying they are not adequate? Districts I have consulted with in Will County do include train derailment incidents.
Can you read
the question?
The beginning of it.
Okay, it says school emergency. Sure. School emergency operations plans in Illinois include a threat-specific annex for hazardous materials incidents. Are you saying they are not adequate?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. More or less, yes.
They're not. They're well, Lake Zurich High School, they knew the railroad was there. They do have, like emergency, like a place to evacuate students to. But, looking at where those options are, they're all too close. What the legislation requires is that the protocol come from the Office of Homeland Security, the people, the authorities who know. School educators, administrators, they don't know emergency response. And even, your local emergency responders, some are better than others, but they're not always having communication between, the EMA and the school administrators and teachers. Teachers don't like, I was an educator for over 30 years, and we never had any kind of evacuation plans, and I was a special education teacher who wrote, emergency response plans into student IEPs. And it was enough to get the student out of the building, but it was never enough to, for example, try to get an autistic student who's going to be in crisis evacuated to another location. So, I would say there may be plans. They are not consistent. They are, they're not universal, within a state. And there's no legal requirement for them to have one. So if one has one here or there, they may, but those conversations where, people are getting together, brainstorming ideas and having like a published protocol. That published protocol does not exist yet. That's what the legislation is doing.
Okay, it seems to be multifaceted depending on situations too, and what types of students are in the school.
Yeah.
Okay, and the last question we have is from Mark. Is there proper PPE safety for first responders? I worry about them.
I do too. I can't tell you how many pictures of firefighters with no apparatus, breathing apparatus, and they're standing right next to these fires. I don't have an answer to that other than I've seen,
the first responders at East Palestine. I saw pictures of them and they had dust masks on, which is not adequate at all.
No, it's not.
I see Jim McGrath has his hand up. Abby,
well,
do you want to
Jim.
go to him?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Jerry, you've raised a whole lot of issues. If we are concerned, what's the first steps? What do we do? We talked to the village board because Barrington High School is within 2 blocks of the Canadian National as well. And I have sat there watching those train cars go by, wobble as they go across the crossing, which concerns me every time I'm sitting there. So where do I start? What do I do? What do I do?
You could have conversations with the school board, but my experience with school boards is they really don't do anything on their own unless the superintendent tells them that it's important for them to do it. You could have a conversation with the superintendent. You could have a conversation with the county. Schools and emergency response are state level issues. Railroad regulation is a federal issue. So you would speak to your congresspersons about that. At the municipal or county level, at the county level, they need to fund their emergency responders. You could speak to your county board members. The school officials, they're going to be in the process of making these plans. What I've been doing is I've been reaching out to some of the schools. Like Lake Zurich, I have a high school I have a special interest in because my grandsons, if my daughter doesn't move, that's where they'll ultimately go to school. And I've got huge concerns about that school. Barrington, that's another area. I know Karen Darch has fought this issue for years. Like back in 2009, I remember reading about her on this issue. But maybe you, or if you have a group of people who are concerned about this, you might approach them, and there's no reason why parents can't be involved in this planning. And I would ask if they would be open to having those conversations with the parents and the PTA groups.
What about Barrington Go Green?
I'm not familiar with them, but
Jim,
is that
it's an environmental group. Yeah, I am on the Barrington Environmental Advisory Committee, and listen to all this hazardous material stuff concerns me. So that's something I will bring up at that next.
Maybe have Jerry come out and give a presentation.
Well,
Jerry, would you do it?
Absolutely. I absolutely would.
You'd have to do it in about 15, 20 minutes.
I can.
You can't get an hour and a half.
I've done it. I know.
Yeah.
I've done it in as short as 15, 20, and I've done it as long as 2 to 2.5 hours.
Okay. If I can get your contact information from Mark, then
Yes.
maybe we can work something like that out.
Yeah.
Just as a thing that I worked for an environmental engineering company that had contracts with the EPA regions, and they had a group. The EPA has a program called START, Superfund Technical Assessment Response Team, which means that anytime there's an incident, the START people, contractors, are called in because EPA doesn't have the staff to do it. The START people had yearly training to run scenarios like this. If there was an incident, what do you do? I think those kinds of things should be put on with the fire and police departments. They should be, they should get, every year we had an 8-hour OSHA refresher training, which brought up some of this, but the START training was really good. And those kinds of things I think are really necessary. In some ways they would be kind of fun because they're eye openers into, you start looking at your own house and you go, gee, I've got some environmental problems here. I don't want this to be like this, so we could start changing it. But that's just, those were the things that we were put through every year. We got an OSHA training, 8-hour refresher, and you were brought up to date on the federal regulations, the catalog of federal regulations stuff. So that's just my thoughts.
And your local emergency planning committee through the county, so Lake County, Barrington's Lake County, right?
Barrington High School is in Lake County, but the administration is in Cook County.
Okay.
Just to make things interesting.
So each
Yeah.
county has a LEPC, and parent community representatives from the community are supposed to be part of that conversation, which they have never, as far as I know, they are, at least it's not current practice to include them in that, and they're supposed to. So, you know, I would go to like the superintendent of the school board and let them know that you would like to be part of these conversations as a parent group or, you know, an environmental organization, and then the LEPC.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got a good relationship with most of the school board members, including the superintendent. But so this SB 71 that's something that I can already talk to the school board about?
It's already, yes. Give me a second and I'll put a link to the legislation that.
I just looked it up on ILGA.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been signed by both, or it's been passed unanimously in both houses, and it's just waiting to be signed. And I think the governor would look really bad if he were to veto a bill that was supposed to protect kids. So I don't expect that he would do that. But
well, and another positive side, a couple of months back, we had some people on from Central Illinois who were fighting against putting those carbon capture storage pipelines underneath, and it was going under the Mahomet aquifer if it got put in, you know, the CO2, and it was defeated unanimously by the House and Senate. So I think, and that was the explosive things from that. You wouldn't want that to be anywhere near you. So we're having some success with some of these things. So, but yeah, this is good. Any other questions, Debbie?
No, I did not see any further questions. That was the last one. Mark, you had the last question there.
No, so we could wait. Jerry, do you want to do a wrap up? Anybody, any other comments? And thank you so much for coming on. This is great.
We have an inquiry as to how to get a copy of Jerry's presentation. Will we be getting that?
Well, it is recorded. If it's on my computer, I will send it to Mark and Bill. And my understanding is you guys put that on your NWSOFA website?
Yep. It will go out to who knows where. I don't know. We had people on from all over. So we had, how many? We still have 27, but we were up to what?
I think we had like 47 at one point.
So
yeah.
It'll be interesting to see where it goes. You're going to get calls, Jerry, so
that's fine.
Be contacted.
And my wrap up ask is please contact your congresspersons and ask for rail safety measures.
And maybe, Jerry, you can come down to Bill's picnic, which will be late August, because there'll be state legislatures and candidates there. So it'll be a hoot. You can bring some of your friends with you.
Yes, now I'm retired. I have time to do these kinds of things.
It'd be lovely to see you. So yeah, and thank you so much for coming on. And
Absolutely.
Thanks everybody for attending, and we'll see what we do next month. So
okay. Mark, just to let you know, I'll send Bill a copy of the chat.
Great.
Thank you.
And thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Jim, and thanks everybody. And we'll
It looks like there's one question that wasn't answered. Are there other countries that have better safety measures?
Oh, thank you.
Oh,
thank you, Susan.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I've talked a lot with Canada, well, people in Canada.
And the railroad people you've talked with a lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same railroad. It's the same railroad companies. You know, Canadian National is not different, whether it's in Canada, the United States, or Mexico, and it goes through all three. And, you know, they have their own private police. They are not regulated any better, and definitely not in Canada, and I doubt they'd be better regulated in Mexico. In Europe, I'm not a good authority on rail safety in Europe, although I do know Railroad Workers United has affiliations in Europe. So I expect that they're also, you know, they're fighting for railroad safety there too. I don't know if it's better or worse though.
Great. Okay, I think we're done. Thanks, Jerry, and thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you next month. We'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.